Good morning. My name is Gary Scudder. I'm a professor here in the Core. And today I want to talk about a film, and actually it's one of my favorite films, and a film which I think is ignored. I think it's considered a cute film, but I think it's far more than a cute film. And that is the film Lars and the Real Girl, which I think is a wonderful film. It's got Ryan Gosling in a very non-Ryan Gosling role. I mean, who knew that Ryan Gosling could actually act? Who plays Lars, a sort of clumsy, dysfunctional, astonishingly socially inept Lars, who could essentially be a Champlain College gamer. He's sort of that hopeless around everybody. And it's a lovely little side cast. Patricia Clarkson, who's always in great films as the doctor who tries to help him out. Emily Mortimer plays his sister-in-law, who's great. Paul Snider plays his brother Gus. Actress Kelly Garner, I think, plays Margot, his would-be pretend girlfriend. She really loves him. And there also is then his real girlfriend, the real girl, and that is Bianca, who's played by a Russian sex doll. I use it in Core 110. I mainly show the students Memento, but sometimes I swap in Lars and the Real Girl, and I have the students write a 5-page paper on it. It's also a film I'm much more likely to show in the Core 130, which is the Summer Bridge, which is the combination of Core 110, concepts of the self, and Core 120, concepts of community. Now, if you don't know the story, and again, if you don't, shame on you, Lars is this very lonely guy who lives out in the garage behind his house where he grew up. And in the house now is his brother Gus, and his sister, and Gus's wife Karen, who lived there, and Karen has just found out that she's pregnant. And Lars keeps fading farther and farther away. And Karen especially takes it upon herself to try to bring him out, and he will never show up. And she literally, one beautiful scene, tackles him in the driveway to get him to come in and actually eat a meal with them. And you get this, and they're sort of like, oh my God, Lars is hopeless. And then one day, he walks in and tells Karen and Gus that he has a girlfriend. And he wants to know if she could actually stay in the house with them because she's very religious and it would not really be appropriate for her to stay in the garage with him. And they're so stunned. And the next scene is this lovely scene of them with their mouth hanging open as Lars is there with his girlfriend Bianca, who is essentially a Russian sex doll that had just showed up through the mail. And it starts off as it's going to be like some bizarre sex comedy. I don't know what the hell is going on here, but this turns into this remarkably sweet, clever film, which I think works so well in regards to the self, but also the community. Because, especially the community is funny, because everybody in the community takes to Bianca. And she gets a job, and she volunteers reading to children. She eventually gets elected to the school board, which causes tension with Lars, because she's not as home as much. And so the notion of how a community comes together is utterly fascinating, and it makes for good paper. And you think about things like, the Trianda study on individualism and collectivism works very well. But where I think it's even better is in the Hawk book, we have the readings on defense mechanisms and Anna Freud's notion of that. And there's so much you can do with examining Lars and why he does what he does. I mean, and I always ask my students this, do you think that Lars, granted you're not a psychologist and terms have meaning, so I will view this with the appropriate sense of dread, but do you think that Lars is actually insane? Or, if you want to be more simplistic, do you think Lars really thinks that Bianca is real? He did order her off the internet, so it's not as if he is completely oblivious to where she showed up. And there's this really sweet scene at the beginning. The first time he takes her to church, he's wheeling her out in her wheelchair, and this older woman who's determined that she's going to browbeat everybody into being nice to Bianca comes up and puts a set of flowers in Bianca's lap. And Lars leans very closely, and a very subtle scene says, they're real, so they don't ever die. And it's this, and what I love about it is they don't play that very well. It's a really subtle scene, and you miss it most of the time if you're not listening to what's going on. And you get this sense of why would this be? And part of this relates to the fact that Lars' own mother had died in childbirth. So when he finds out that Karen, his beloved sister-in-law, is pregnant, this is what pushes him over the edge. And there's all sort of subtle things, especially the use of the color pink, which is really big in the entire thing. He actually wears as a scarf the baby blanket that his mother made for him shortly before she dies. And when he takes Bianca and puts her into the house, he says, can she stay in the pink room? And that the pink room, as they always refer to it, was his mother's room. I don't want to ruin the entire story, but they have this relationship, and eventually at a certain point, Bianca dies. And it's very sad. But part of it is Lars also discovers a real girl, and that is Margot. Again, Kelly Garner gives this astonishingly funny, klutzy role that I've literally had some of my students say that they could not watch because they completely understood. Like, she's so clearly in love with him, but she's just so clumsy that they literally find it painful to watch her because they're both sort of ridiculous. But in the end, they eventually come to some understanding. I think so many things about sublimation and projection. It's a very accessible film. So even if you're just asking, again, I always have my students, that's what I always do. If I show them a film, they have to always write at least a 5-page paper. I think it is accessible enough that students can use some of the topics from the 110, especially the Hawk book, and even some of the stuff, I suppose, from the 120 in regards to community, and talk about why this works. So it's funny, but I think it's much more than simply a romantic comedy. I think it deals with some more profound issues of identity, personal survival, for that matter, I guess, sexuality. How does one determine meaning, happiness, satisfaction? So anyway, I think it's an extraordinary film. I've shown it many, many times. I'm showing it again this semester in the repeater section of 110. I showed a little bit of it the other day. We were discussing the chapter, because even if you don't want to use the entire film, I've also had success using snippets of it. Just in the discussion we had with Hawk about defense mechanisms, I showed a couple little scenes. One is, again, Lars first coming up and telling his brother and sister-in-law that he has a visitor, Bianca, and their response. But then a couple other scenes later on where you're getting a sense of how popular she is. And also the scene where Lars resuscitates Margot's teddy bear who had been killed by a co-worker. And even that's very symbolic of him coming back to life and essentially resuscitating his sense of love and life. So it's an extraordinary film. I highly recommend it. In fact, I have a copy of it, which I'm happily loaned to you. So if anyone has any questions, I would love to talk about it more. Thank you.